So I'm Kenny Easwaran, assistant professor at the University of Southern California.
And I'm Jonathan Weisberg, assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And we're here to talk about full and partial belief. So why don't we get started by introducing the two concepts, full and partial belief. I'll talk a bit about full belief, and then Kenny, you can introduce the topic of partial belief.
Okay.
All right, so full belief is usually distinguished from partial belief by being an on-off state, something that either does or doesn't attain, as opposed to a graded state that comes in various degrees. And full belief is the on-off mental state that's typically expressed by belief that reports. So we say that S believes that P or thinks that P. For example, we would say that Kenny believes that the moon is smaller than the sun, and that would be a report of Kenny's on-off belief. On-off full belief is also often called on-off belief or flat-out belief or sometimes acceptance. And there are really 3 or 4 possible states that someone can be in with respect to full belief in a proposition. They can believe it, they can disbelieve it, they can suspend judgment about it, or they might also have no opinion, and it's sort of controversial whether suspending judgment is the same as having no opinion. Someone who has no opinion may have never considered the question, whereas someone who suspends judgment may have considered the question and decided not to either believe or disbelieve. Now, full belief is usually associated with classically associated with 3 roles in cognition. If you believe something, you tend to use it as a premise in inference, in reasoning about theoretical matters. You'll act on the assumption that it's true, and you'll also be inclined to assert it sincerely if you're asked about it. And full belief is also thought to be subject to the norms of classical logic. So at a bare minimum, to be rational in your full beliefs, people classically have thought that you need to, for example, not believe any contradictions, so you should never believe that there's a round square outside. But even more so, your belief set as a whole, your corpus of beliefs, some say should be logically consistent. So if you believe that P and you believe that if P is true, then Q is true, it would be irrational to believe that Q is false. So those are considered often bare minimum norms of rationality for full belief. And one of the reasons that full belief has been particularly interesting to epistemologists in the last 40 or 50 years is that it seems to be the doxastic attitude that's required for knowledge. So analyses of knowledge typically assume at a bare minimum that you have to, in order to know that P is true, you have to believe that P. And together with various other conditions, analyses of knowledge try to distinguish beliefs that constitute knowledge from beliefs that don't constitute knowledge. So, for example, formulations of theories like reliabilism, according to which a belief constitutes knowledge just in case it's formed by a reliable process, frame knowledge in terms of belief, and similarly, conditions like tracking conditions and safety conditions on knowledge are usually formulated in terms of full belief. In order to track the truth, you have to be disposed to believe P as long as it's true, but disposed to not believe it as long as it's false, and so forth. So that's a bit of background on full belief. Kenny, do you want to say a bit about partial belief?
Sure. Yeah, so partial belief is probably a bit more of a recent notion. I think it's largely introduced in the early 20th century with the work of Frank Ramsey and Bruno De Finetti. They were both interested in notions of probability and noticed that often we use probabilities to talk about things that aren't really subject to chance or some other sort of external objective process. So just as we might say that there's some probability that the die will come up 6 when you roll it, if the die has already been rolled, there's still some sense in which, if I haven't seen it, I want to say that there's a probability of 1/6 that it came up 6. But there's no objective chance here anymore. It's either 6 or it isn't. And so instead, what Ramsey and De Finetti and others want to say is that this notion of probability is expressing something about my mental attitude. And then there's a variety of different ways of getting at this attitude. Ramsey notes that you might think of belief as something that comes in degrees. Some of your beliefs are stronger than others. Now, when we first think about this notion, we might think there are some beliefs that I hold to very strongly and are very central in my mind, and some that are much more peripheral. But he points out that that's not necessarily the relevant measure of strength here. Sometimes the beliefs that we hold most strongly are the ones that we don't even notice at all. And so he proposed instead that we should look at the way that belief plays a role in guiding our actions. And so he and various others have proposed that the degree of belief that you have can often be adequately measured by looking at either what sort of stakes you'd be willing to gamble on for that proposition, or what odds you'd think are fair, or perhaps more generally, thinking of all of our actions as in some sense guided by our uncertainty about the world, just look at what actions we would find more preferable to others, given our uncertainty about what the outcome will be and what the values of these outcomes will be. And then once Ramsey and De Finetti started talking about this notion of partial belief, many other epistemologists and philosophers of science have tried to develop it into a further theory that can help explain issues like scientific confirmation, or all the modern techniques of formal epistemology that relate partial belief to probability. And then, of course, this raises the question, how do these notions of partial belief and probability relate to the traditional questions of full belief that epistemologists have been looking at for hundreds of years before this?
So, yeah, so then if we've got these two notions on the table, the degrees of belief, and full belief is governed by deductive logic, and partial belief is governed by, say, the rules of probability theory and maybe expected utility maximization for decision making, I guess then the natural question to ask is then, how do these interact? And I take it that there's a few sort of standard paradoxes that have gotten a lot of attention in the last 40 years about how the two are related. So I guess one natural thought, for example, is that what it is to believe something just is to be very, very sure that it's true, to have a very high degree of belief in it. Or at the very least, you might think something analogous holds as a norm. If you're very, very confident that something is true, then you should believe it in the sense of full belief. And that takes us into the territory of the lottery paradox. So do you want to just explain the lottery paradox?
Sure. Yeah, the lottery paradox, I believe that was introduced by Henry Kaiberg, but the idea is that if you have a lottery with 1 million tickets in it, then if you understand how the lottery works, you can be fairly confident of each ticket that it will not win. In fact, you might have degree of belief 99.9999% that it's not going to win. And so if there's some sort of threshold, you might think that that would be sufficient to count as believing that the ticket's not going to win. But in that case, you'd say that of each ticket that you believe that it's not going to win, and yet you also believe that one of the tickets is going to win. That looks like a contradiction, which looks like a problem for full belief. And even more so, if the prize of the lottery is big enough, it might be perfectly rational to buy a ticket, and in that case you wouldn't want to say that you're buying the ticket even though you believe it's not going to win. And so many people have wanted to say that in the lottery cases, you actually don't count as believing that the ticket's not going to win, no matter how big the lottery is, and no matter what the degree of belief is. And so that looks like it's going to say that no threshold is high enough to count as believing.
Right. So, and then there's the closely related preface paradox, which has a similar structure, but is, I think, importantly different. So the preface paradox is the one where an author writes a book, and they've, let's suppose, carefully researched all the background, and they've used their sources judiciously, and they haven't claimed anything too outrageously controversial. Maybe, for example, it's a grade 4 history book. And so the author presumably believes everything they've written in the book, but then, of course, when they get to the preface, it's very natural for them to say that they take responsibility for the errors that will inevitably be found in their book. So it seems, on the one hand, that they believe each claim they've written. On the other hand, they recognize that one of them is, at least one of them is bound to be false. And so this person believes a bunch of individually highly probable claims, but also believes the highly probable claim that one of those claims is false. And it seems there that they have an inconsistent set of beliefs. And so I gather we could take a few different morals from there. One would be that it's rationally permissible to have an inconsistent set of beliefs, provided that each of them is highly probable.
Right. But the preface case does seem to be different from the lottery case in this way, in that I think most people share the intuition in the preface case, you're perfectly reasonable to believe all of these claims despite them being inconsistent. While in the
Right.
lottery case, many people want to say that you should at best suspend judgment on the individual tickets winning
Right.
rather than actively believing. And yet they probabilistically look the same. You might have the same degrees of belief in each of the lottery tickets not winning as you do in each of the claims in the history book. And
Right.
yet in one case you want to believe, in the other case you don't.
Yeah, I think that's a really common intuition. I have that intuition. What about you?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's
So I
generally
think
what I think.
one of the interesting things about that is that the preface you might take to show that um, uh, full belief doesn't actually have to conform to fully to certain norms of deductive logic. So in particular, it seems that it's rationally permissible to believe each of two conjuncts without believing their conjunction. So for example, it's rational to believe each claim in the author's book without believing the conjunction of all of them.
Right.
And if
And
you,
since there's only finitely many claims in the book, that means that somewhere along the line there must be some pair such that the author believes two members of a pair without believing their conjunction.
right, yeah, exactly. And if you take that to be one of the morals of the preface paradox, then it seems you can go back to the lottery paradox, and then maybe you can actually recover the initial conjecture that if you think something is highly likely, then it's rational to believe it, because then you'll be okay with an inconsistent belief set in the lottery paradox, because we've abandoned the conjunction rule in light of the preface paradox.
Right. And this is something that I think many people working in the probability, degree of belief, formal epistemology tradition have felt tempted to do, is to say, with the probabilities and degrees of belief, we've got a clear sense of what it takes to be rational. You just have to satisfy the probability axioms. And in these cases, like the lottery case and the preface case, they look relevantly similar. If we're just thinking in terms of full beliefs, we get some very equivocal intuitions. We don't really know what to think about the lottery case. Maybe we should just get rid of the full belief notions or somehow replace them with the notions from Bayesianism. The degrees of belief seem to account for all the actions that we need to worry about. So all our decisions of how to base our actions on the information in a textbook or whether or not to buy particular lottery tickets. And so it looks like there's not much room left for the traditional notions of traditional epistemology. And I think this has led some people to want to reject those traditional notions.
Right. So I usually call this view eliminativism, the idea that degrees of belief are sort of the more real, maybe metaphysically most fundamental state, but especially normatively the most important focus for epistemology, whereas full beliefs should be rejected or abandoned as some sort of folk theoretical relic. And I think Richard Jeffrey might have held something like that view. He might have been a bit of an eliminativist. He certainly thought that it wasn't very important to keep track of full belief talk, and really he thought that subjective probabilities or degrees of belief were really the focal point for epistemology.
Right. Now, of course, there are some people that have the completely opposite view, that perhaps belief and disbelief are really the important notions, and that all this degree of belief stuff is just some mathematical technicalities that we've made up in the 20th century that are interesting to play with, but aren't necessarily going to reveal anything interesting about epistemology.
Yeah.
And I think this is what's behind some of the skepticism that certain people have of formal epistemology. And especially if people like Jeffrey are going to then say that we should just replace full belief talk by probability all the way down, then that, I think, perhaps leads to even more apparent conflict between the two sorts of views here.
Right. So I think some people haven't been quite as extreme as going one way or the other, so sort of trying to reject full belief in favor of partial belief, or reject partial belief in terms of full belief. Some people have tried to think that, well, we can talk about both of them. In particular, I think the most popular thought has been that full belief can be reduced to partial belief. And perhaps the simplest and most prominent view here is Lockeanism. And Lockeanism is the view that I mentioned it a minute ago, but it's the idea that what it is to believe something is just to have a high degree of belief in it, a degree of belief above a certain threshold.
Mhm.
But other people have adopted more sophisticated views. So, for example, I think David Christensen holds that full belief supervenes on partial belief, though he doesn't say exactly how it depends on it. He mentions an analogy
Mhm.
where, like, saying that someone believes or disbelieves is sort of like sorting dogs into categories of large, medium, and small. So
Mhm.
maybe what he has in mind there is that belief attributions are somewhat context sensitive. Maybe on the speaker side, maybe
Right.
on the subject side. I'm not entirely sure, but that's one way you could go. Or you could say
Right.
that you could try to offer a more sophisticated reduction of full belief instead of just reducing it to partial belief. You could reduce it to partial belief plus some other factors. So, for example,
Mhm.
I think Isaac Levi, Patrick Marr, and Mark Kaplan are big on the idea that when you believe something or when you ought to believe something is really a function of two things: how certain you are of it and how much cognitive value believing it has, especially if it's right. So cognitive value is something like how informative your beliefs will be,
Mhm.
or how explanatory your belief set will then, how explanatorily rich your belief set will then be if you take on this extra commitment. So you could go that way
Right.
too. But I gather you have a pretty different take on this. You're interested in actually, instead of reducing full belief to partial belief, you're interested in reducing partial belief to full belief.
Right. I mean, that's an idea that I've been interested in lately. I'm not sure that I actually am any more confident in the success of that sort of program than the success of these other ones that we've been discussing.
Right. Fair
But
enough.
uh, but I think it's an interesting project that actually might have some motivation to it. I think it could be more congenial to people who are worried about Bayesianism and degrees of belief. I mean, so one of the major worries people have about all this degree of belief talk is that we tend to be always acting as though there's some specific number in the interval 0 to 1 that represents your degree of belief in any given proposition.
Hmm.
Now, of course, there are some techniques that various people have had to try to suggest maybe it's not a single number, maybe it's a set of numbers, but even when you go to that sort of level, there's some surprising amount of precision in how wide those sets are, which just doesn't seem to be the case based on either our own introspective awareness of our beliefs or degrees of belief, uh, or perhaps even in any of our practices regarding them. And the idea that I've been thinking about lately is that a defender of the full belief picture might take something like the Lockean thesis as a way of reducing partial belief to full belief.
Hmm.
So the idea is that we would have some sort of normative constraints on our full beliefs. Now, we don't want to insist that our beliefs must be consistent because that would mean that rational people would never find themselves in the preface situation, and yet most of us want to say that the preface situation is a rational situation to be in.
Hmm.
Um, but instead, we have some somewhat weaker norm of coherence. The idea that I have in mind here is perhaps related to some issues that Jim Joyce has brought up about measuring the accuracy of either full or partial beliefs. We can talk a bit more about that later. But uh, I've got an idea related to this notion of accuracy, and I think I can show that if you just assume that your full beliefs should be such that there is no other set of full beliefs that is guaranteed to be more accurate than them,
Hmm.
then there must exist some probability function such that you believe all the propositions that have probability above some threshold on that function, disbelieve all the ones that have probability below some threshold, and suspend judgment on everything that's in between.
Hmm.
And and then the idea would be that really the full beliefs and disbeliefs are going to be the fundamental attitudes here. And then the fact about your accuracy is going to mean that there exists some probability function. Maybe it's not unique, maybe there's going to be many such probability functions. And then for mathematical purposes, we can represent you in terms of this probability function, or maybe in terms of several different probability functions. And as a mathematical representation, this will capture all of the ideas we have about your preferences among various actions.
Hmm.
But we might be able to say that somehow fundamentally, all that really exists is the full belief, and that the partial belief is just some representation of this full belief state.
Right. So, so the representation, I take it, it assumes that the person's full beliefs obey some minimal kind of coherence constraint.
Right.
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 So I guess I had a couple questions on that that might help kind of clarify the picture. One is that kind of coherence. I gather it's weaker than logical consistency, and that's where you
Yes.
have the advantage in the preface paradox. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Right. And I think one thing that might make people a little bit apprehensive about the weaker kind of coherence is that, you know, for one thing, we're all familiar with deductive logic, but also we're all under the sort of illusion that we can recognize deductive consistency pretty readily, maybe because of, you know, the familiar sort of syntactic tests that we all get taught in logic class. Is there anything kind of approaching that for the kind of coherence, the weaker kind of coherence that you'd be using, or is there another way of sort of explaining it to make it more comfortable to those familiar with deductive consistency?
Right. I mean, the way that I've been thinking about this notion of coherence initially is in terms of just counting how many of your beliefs would be true if the world were a certain way and how many of them would be false. So what we do is just enumerate all the propositions that you're considering, which of course may raise various issues if that set isn't finite. But enumerate all the propositions that we're considering, and then for each logically possible state of the world, count how many of your beliefs would be true and disbeliefs would be false, versus how many of your beliefs would be false and disbeliefs would be true. And then look at that over all the logically possible ways the world could be. If there is some other set of beliefs and disbelief that would be guaranteed to get more things right in every way the world could be, then it seems that the latter would be a better belief state to be in rather than the former.
Right.
And so we can just consider some very simple examples. So for instance, let's say there's a language with just one basic proposition. We've got P, and we've got its negation. Now, under classical logic, we'd want to say that you shouldn't believe both P and not P, because those are inconsistent. Now, if you do end up finding yourself in the situation where you believe both P and not P, it turns out that there's no other belief set that is guaranteed to get more things right, because the only other belief sets are believe neither of them, or believe one of them and disbelieve the other, or suspend judgment in some cases. Either way, if you do have this inconsistent belief set, you're always going to get one belief right and one belief wrong. Whereas with any of the others, you're never guaranteed to do any better than that. You might get 0 right and 0 wrong, or you might sometimes get both right, but the consistent belief sets that sometimes give you both right can also be wrong on both propositions if you're just wrong about the state of the world. But the constraint that we do get is that that if there are 3 or more inconsistent beliefs, then you shouldn't have all of them, because believing all of them, you're going to be guaranteed to get at least 2 things wrong and at most 1 thing right. Whereas if you believe none of them, then you'd be guaranteed to get nothing wrong and nothing right, which is better than 2 things wrong and 1 thing right. And so we can then generalize this notion of counting how many things you get right or wrong to account for what to do in cases of suspending judgment. And what we end up with is some sort of considerations that show that you shouldn't be believing sets that are too inconsistent, but you might believe ones that are only moderately inconsistent. And this is going to be especially prominent in cases like the preface paradox. In cases like the preface paradox, it looks like when you're believing all of these propositions, in every state of the world, you're going to get at least one of them wrong. Either it'll be one of the claims in the book, or it'll be the preface claim. But it might be the case that there's, and it seems very plausible, there's not going to be any other belief set that is guaranteed to do better. if you suspended judgment on one of the claims in the book instead of believing it, you'd be consistent. But if that one happens to be true, then you'd actually be doing worse than you do by believing all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have any particular reason to give up any one of them rather than any other, this notion of counting how many beliefs are true or false is going to tell you that the preface situation is, well, at least there's nothing that's guaranteed to do any better unless you can get more information.
Right. So
right.
that's a nice result. I guess what I want to ask is, I think one of the nice things about deductive consistency is that, at least in a lot of cases, you can recognize pretty readily when you violate it. Usually just by, or often just by looking at a small subset of your beliefs, often even just a few of them. Whereas the sort of counting method sounds like it requires a much more exhaustive procedure to check whether you've satisfied it. Is there a shorter way of checking or setting little alarms for yourself to see if you violated it?
Yeah, so I haven't yet worked any of this out in a syntactic way. That would certainly be an interesting thing to look at. See if there are some simple local constraints on your beliefs that would guarantee that you satisfy this weaker coherence norm. I suspect that there's not actually going to be any, which might be an interesting worry to raise for this sort of norm, because it seems that there might be sets that are sort of minimally bad that can be arbitrarily large. So if you have a set of 15 beliefs such that it's guaranteed that no 8 of them could be simultaneously true, but any 7 of them could be simultaneously true, then this set will be bad according to my my criterion, but there's no small subset of it that shows why this whole set is bad.
Right.
So,
though it seems like a lot of the times we can sort of tell whether, or at least we have some sort of intuitions about whether, like when an inconsistent belief set is somehow, in some weaker sense, coherent. Maybe because we have a way of recognizing that there is a probabilistic representation of it. Maybe because in some sense we embody that probabilistic representation, and so we may have some shortcut through the probabilistic representations for checking for this weaker kind of coherence. And that would be really interesting to see where that goes. Let me just ask you one other thing about this approach. So the idea is that if someone satisfies the weaker kind of full belief coherence, then what their credences are can, so to speak, be read off of their full beliefs by looking for what probability functions would represent that full belief set. Is that right so far?
Right, to some extent. There's going to be, I think in general, many different probability functions that will all equally well represent the full belief set, and the claim might be that the existence of these different probability functions that all represent the full beliefs equally well might be why we often feel uncomfortable assigning a particular degree of belief to some proposition, like, say, the proposition that Obama is going to be reelected. I certainly don't have 100% belief in that, and my degree of belief is not that low, but I don't have any very precise idea of what the number might be. And it seems very strange to say that there even is a particular number, even if I don't have access to it.
Right, and that seems like a desirable result,
Yeah.
So on the kind of reduction you're describing, we would read off a particular probability function or maybe a set of probability functions from the person's full beliefs. And that's actually kind of reminiscent of the sort of standard approach, and especially one advocated by Jeffrey back in, I think, '83, where he said, if someone's credences, there might be a little bit of indeterminacy, and so, but what their degrees of belief are can be read off of their preferences instead of their full beliefs. And so Jeffrey thought that was also a desirable feature of his way of reducing degrees of belief to another state. So he was reducing degrees of belief or indeterminate degrees of belief to preferences, whereas you're suggesting maybe we can do the same thing for reducing it to full beliefs.
Right. And of course, that Jeffrey idea of reducing it to preferences goes back at least through Savage in the 50s to Ramsey even in the 20s.
one of the reasons I mentioned the Jeffrey thing is because what I was thinking was Jeffrey thought it was a nice feature of his particular way of reducing it. So Savage, when he did his reduction, he got just a single degree of belief function, right? So someone tells you all their preferences, and then you find the single probability function that represents those preferences. Whereas Jeffrey's theorem was a bit different from Savage's, and it
That's right.
turned back a range of probability functions that could represent those
That's
preferences. Right. And Jeffrey in '83 said maybe that's a good thing because, as you say, we often feel sort of uncomfortable pinning down a particular number. And I guess one of the things I was thinking was, insofar as we're interested in getting away from intervals of credences or sets of probability functions as a representation of the sort of indeterminacy or vagueness of someone's credences, we might face the same problem on either side, whether we're reducing full beliefs to preferences or partial beliefs to preferences or partial beliefs to full beliefs. So I was just wondering if maybe there's an advantage that one reduction has over the other.
Right. I mean, one of the issues that I think has often been discussed around this is generally a criticism of the decision theory-oriented approaches, which is that they seem to be somehow fundamentally relating doxastic or epistemic states of partial belief to states about one's preferences and desires. And many people have thought that if the reason that our degrees of belief are supposed to satisfy the probability axioms is because otherwise our preferences would be incoherent, well, that seems to be introducing some level of practical rationality into what we might have thought at first was a purely epistemic or doxastic norm.
Right.
And that was the motivation, I think, for Joyce and some others in coming up with these new arguments for the probability axioms in terms of accuracy.
Right. So that does seem a really nice advantage. So one way of thinking about what you're doing is replacing the pragmatic rationality foundation that goes with people like Savage and Jeffrey, and instead trying to replace it with an epistemic normative foundation for 4 degrees of belief.
Right.
Yeah, that seems
That's
really
right.
Cool.
Yeah.
So do you mind if I switch the topic just a bit to talk about something a little bit
Oh,
different?
go for it, yeah.
So one of the things I've been really interested in lately is people who are trying to go the other way. So I think the approach you just described where we try and reduce degrees of belief to full belief is new. The more traditional approach is to try and reduce full belief to degrees of belief. So people like the Lockeans who want to say to believe something is to be very confident of it.
Right.
And I thought it'd be worthwhile thinking through sort of what are some of the reasons for that view and what are some of the reasons against. So I thought I'd just throw out some arguments that I've come across or that just sort of seem obvious, and we could bat them around and see what we think. So I've always wondered why people, it seems very natural to me, as it does to many people, why it seems natural to think that full belief might just be high degree of belief. And I was trying to think, well, why is that so appealing? And there are a few things. One thing I thought of was that, well, the most obvious one is just that they tend to go together. It's pretty rare that you fully believe something, and then someone says, well, how sure are you of that? And you think, not very. I mean, if you say not very, it sounds like you're backing off of what you initially, the commitment you initially had, right?
Yeah. And at least it seems that when you count as having a full belief, in almost all those circumstances, you ought to say that you're more confident that it's true than that it's not true. So your degree of belief should be at least 1/2, certainly. Right.
So it seems very hard to say that you believe something, but you give it credence less than 0.5, or even just 0.5. Yeah. Though I think so. Patrick Mars suggested an argument against that view. I think if I remember him right, and this is in his '93 book. I think he says that people assert things flat out that and thus seem to believe them, even though their credences are clearly lower than 0.5. And I think his favorite example is someone like Einstein back in the day asserting the truth of, say, general relativity over and over again in many writings, even though his credence is presumably lower than 0.5 just because he knows that scientific revolutions happen and they keep happening, and so presumably he's apprised of the historical record and therefore more cautious than to assign a high credence to general theory relativity. I don't find that argument convincing, but I have a hard time saying why. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the main thought I've normally had on that is that it it seems plausible that the attitudes we have to scientific theories and perhaps philosophical views and other things like that is, at least in some important ways, different from the ordinary attitude I have to things like there's a table in front of me, and the other sorts of ordinary beliefs that we have. It seems that our scientific and other theoretical views are, in some important sense, much more provisional, and I believe that some people have at least suggested that the attitude we have towards them is perhaps what they might call acceptance rather than belief. So some people draw this distinction that acceptance is an attitude of taking something for granted for some sort of purpose of theoretical work, while belief is the actual notion that plays an important role in guiding our actions.
And just so I don't misrepresent Marr, I should mention that I think he actually takes that view. He separates acceptance from belief, and he says that Einstein accepted his theory, though Marr doesn't like to talk in terms of full belief. But anyway, sorry, please go on.
Right, so that's one of the responses people might take to this apparent source of data, where we've got low degree of belief and yet seem to have belief. You might say those aren't really beliefs; those are really some other attitude.
Right. Okay.
But saying that might just be an attempt to defend a thesis that maybe we have other reasons to think that we shouldn't accept. I mean, I'm not sure what else you've got right now.
I'm sorry. Say again.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that maybe this move to distinguish acceptance from belief is just an attempt to save some theory that that we have some initial pull towards, but if we don't have any good arguments for it, or if we have other good arguments against it, then maybe we don't need to make this sort of move.
Right. Or you might just think that we fall prey to the appeal of knowing the answer to a certain question, and so we momentarily believe certain scientific theories, and then upon reflection realize that we shouldn't have believed them. I think that's probably more error theory than a lot of people want to swallow.
Yeah.
So another argument in this neighborhood that I've been especially interested in lately is the idea that maybe sometimes you can have a full belief in something without having any degree of belief in it. And I think perhaps the best candidate, or at least one good candidate for such a case, is where you perceive something and you make a snap decision based on what you perceive, but you don't give it anywhere near enough thought to really formulate anything like a credence or a level of confidence. So if I'm one of my favorite examples is I'm at the pizza parlor and I'm trying to decide which pizza I want, and I see that the one on the left has mushrooms on it, and I want mushrooms, so I ask for a slice of that pizza. It seems like it's all right to say, I think there's mushrooms on the pizza, I believe there's mushrooms on that pizza, but I have a hard time saying that there's any fact of the matter what my degree of belief is that there are mushrooms on that pizza. Do you find cases like that convincing at all?
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems that the defender of the degrees of belief here is just going to want to say that, as Ramsey said, our degrees of belief are not directly introspectively accessible to us, and so someone who says that your full beliefs somehow supervene or depend on your partial beliefs might be perfectly happy saying, oh, you do have a very high degree of belief here, it's 99.9% or something, or probably much higher than that, and sure, you haven't ever considered that, but the claim is going to be that somehow our mind settles into degrees of belief much more quickly than we might expect, just as our brains seem to be able to do all sorts of other complicated math in certain circumstances very quickly. We can catch a ball when someone's throwing it to us, even though we don't know how to solve second-order partial differential equations that it looks like are involved in actually catching that ball.
Right. So it seems like there's a couple of factors here. One is that it seems introspectively hard to access anything that feels like a degree of confidence or a degree of belief. But it also seems like from a third-person standpoint, it's hard to ascribe a degree of belief to that person. Maybe you don't feel this tension, but for me it seems really hard to say that that person is even just to say they're highly confident there's mushrooms on that pizza sounds really off to me. I'm much more
But I worry that...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I worry that the reason that it sounds off is because saying that someone is highly confident seems to implicate that they are not at some even higher level that we just don't ordinarily talk about. it's just it seems strange to say that I'm highly confident that 1 plus 1 equals 2, even though it looks like that's something that's a proposition I've considered many different times in my life, and it looks like I am in as good a position to have a degree of belief in that as most others.
Uh-huh. And so that sounds funny to you. The 1 plus 1 case sounds funny to you in the same way that the pizza case sounds funny.
I think so, but I'm not sure. I haven't thought about this pizza case as much, so I don't know.
Right. So I guess one thing that I wonder about when I kind of get to this point in this dialectic is I start to think, what would differentiate, say, the reductive view, the view that full belief supervenes on partial belief or reduces to partial belief,
Right.
from another view on which they're two distinct but maybe interacting states.
Right.
Is there any way to tell those views apart? And also maybe tell them apart from a third view, which I'm actually quite sympathetic to, the view that full belief and partial belief actually have a common supervenience space. Neither one reduces to or supervenes on the other, but they're constituted by a lot of the same states. So what it takes to be highly confident of something is generally to be disposed to act on it, to have memories of it, to have perceptual states that suggest it, to have lots of evidence for it, and so on. And the same thing for a belief. So what it takes, what other cognitive states have to be in place in order to have a high degree of belief, and whatever it takes to have in place to have a full belief, seems like a lot of the same states. And I start to wonder if there's any way of sort of settling disputes over which way the reduction goes. Does one reduce to the other? Does neither reduce? Or do they have a common supervenience space? And I actually, this is something I've been puzzling about lately, and I don't have a view about it. Do you have any thoughts?
Right. I'm not sure. Let me just get clear on what the range of alternatives is here that we've been considering. So
Sure.
one is the idea that there is just one or the other, and that one of these two notions is confused. I don't think either of us is very favorable towards that view.
Fair enough.
Then there's the next view that either full belief supervenes on partial belief or partial belief supervenes on full belief, or that one of them is reducible to the other, which we've been spending some time discussing. Then there's a notion that both notions exist and are real and have certain important normative relations to one another, but neither supervenes on the other or reduces to the other. And then is there some fourth position that you're proposing here, that do you think this idea that these two states are both reducible to some third type of state, is there some important sense in which that's different from the idea that both states exist and have some connections to each other but are not
No,
dependent on some
it's not importantly different as long as those connections are descriptive and pretty strong necessary connections. But yeah, I think it's a variety of that last view you mentioned.
Okay. So there's a distinction between saying that that full and partial beliefs have some normative connection to each other versus saying that full and partial beliefs, because of their nature and the way that they depend on some further fact about either the mind or the body or something like that, just can't come apart in certain types of ways.
Yeah. So on that view, for example, it would be possible to have one state without the other, but if you had both a flat-out state and a partial state, they would have to coordinate to some extent. So, and that would be used to explain why high degree of belief and full belief tend to go together.
Right. And it seems that on some sort of physicalist picture of the world, one might be forced into that position because a physicalist probably wants to say that the fundamental states are not doxastic at all. They're states of the body and arrangements of neurons and whatever perhaps features of the extended mind might be relevant, but that fundamentally it's all physical stuff, and so there's going to be some facts about those physical things that constitute being in a certain partial belief state or a certain full belief state, and that those constitution relations are going to necessitate some connections between the two, but at least some of those connections are not going to be normative. They're going to be just facts about how the reduction works.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Hmm.
So I mean, there's this whole debate about the metaphysics about what reduces to what, if anything. Um,
Hmm.
and I guess maybe something that's worth thinking about is whether that's important for what people in epistemology really care about. I gather what
Right.
people are really interested in here when they try to do one reduction of the others. They try to make the normative theory of one primary and the normative theory of the other
Yeah.
derivative. So, for example, the
Right.
Lockeans want to say that the theory of, say, maybe the normative theory of probability calculus that applies to partial beliefs, and then what you
Hmm.
should or shouldn't fully believe just falls out of that. So whether you should believe the
Right.
conjunction of two full beliefs depends on the probability or your degree of belief in that conjunction. Um,
Hmm.
so they would say that the conjunction rule from deductive logic that's not necessarily binding. It holds only when the probability calculus underlying and governing your partial beliefs underwrites it.
Right. And so perhaps that one motivation for that is the idea that Harman pointed out long ago that we don't reason by just blindly following the inference rules of deductive logic. We reason in some more complicated way.
Hmm.
Now, he, of course, was not very sympathetic to the idea that probabilities are going to underlie our reasoning,
Hmm.
but some of these people might be and might say, well, the way we get the constraints we have on our reasoning about full beliefs is going to be just because full beliefs reduce to partial beliefs in
Hmm.
some way, and then we just look at what the constraints are on partial beliefs and how you ought to update those.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think it's interesting you mentioned Kahneman here, and I'm glad you did because
Yeah.
I think at the same time, while Kahneman, a lot of his work and a lot of the work that comes out of that tradition suggests that we don't obey something like the rules of deductive logic when
Hmm.
reasoning. At the same time, Kahneman and a lot of people after him have taken the research to show that we also don't reason using the probability calculus,
Right.
and in fact, we may sort of use lots of heuristic shortcuts, some of which
Hmm.
include simplifications or distortions of the probabilistic calculus, and some of which might even use something that doesn't look anything like probabilistic reasoning.
Hmm.
So, for example, one explanation for the famous bank teller fallacy, where people rate the probability of a conjunction higher than the probability of one of its conjuncts, is that
Hmm.
people are really doing something like matching degrees of similarity instead of evaluating degrees of certainty.
Right.
Um, and,
Right.
and one of the reasons I think that's really interesting is because I think it might suggest that people who try to make the normative theory of partial belief more fundamental and then sort of think of the theory of full belief as just kind of along for the ride, it's sort of normatively epiphenomenal. Um,
Hmm.
Contrary to that, I'm actually sympathetic to a view on which full belief and partial belief coordinate with one another um, as a sort of way of simplifying in some places. So full belief is a sort of coarse attitude; it's only kind of on and off.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that allows us to simplify a lot of reasoning. At the same time, degrees of belief being subtler might allow us to be more accurate. And so I
Yeah.
think, in fact, the sort of tradition of like Kahneman's, where we think of people as reasoning with heuristics, um,
Yeah.
it might be that part of that sort of heuristic system for reasoning fast, fast but reasoning more or less efficiently,
Right.
depends crucially on having both belief states in play. And so the nitty
Yeah.
gritty norms that of the norms that we actually ought to follow might actually depend on both states.
Yeah.
And that's actually a view that I think Richard Foley defends something like that in working with that in net. And he
Okay.
suggests. Sorry, did I talk over you there?
No. No.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so he suggests, for example, that when assessing how likely something is, for example, forming a degree of belief about whether a die will roll 6, we make certain assumptions that we treat as given, even though really we're not 100% certain. We treat them as
Hmm.
close enough that we'll just take them for
Hmm.
granted. For example, the assumption that the die is physically symmetrical.
Hmm.
Which we may not be 100% sure of, but we treat it as 100% certain because, for the current
Right.
purposes, treating it as 100% certain will lead us to have a credence about rolling a 6 that's close enough um,
Yeah.
for present purposes. Um,
Yeah.
and it might be that the kind of heuristics that Kahneman and Tversky and the rest of that tradition have discovered actually similarly exploit a combination of simplicity drawing on full belief and accuracy drawing on partial beliefs
Hmm.
to balance the cognitive load.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that if we're going to get at the correct picture of what's going on, something like this sort of complicated interplay of the two types of attitudes, with both playing some sort of heuristic role in certain circumstances, seems like the most plausible and interesting way to go. Of course, it's going to be much more complicated to see what's going on with all of these different states if you can't just reduce one to the other.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, incidentally, some of the heuristics that have become popular in that literature actually, I think, do suggest this kind of interplay picture. So one of the most famous is one that's been popularized, especially by Gigerenzer, but it goes way back to Payne, Bettman, and Johnson, and a bunch of other people, and that's what's known often as take the best, also called the lexicographic heuristic. That's where when you're trying to make a decision, instead of weighing all the possible, states of affairs and all the possible outcomes of each action, what you do is you instead think, well, look at each option and think like what features does each option have, and you might just run through one or two, maybe three features of each option, and consider just a few of them and make a decision on that basis. So, for example, if you're choosing between two restaurants, you might just think about how do they compare on price, how do they compare in terms of taste, and as soon as you find something that cuts a difference between them, maybe like they're about equivalent in price, but one of them tends to taste better, you'll go with that decision without having weighed all the options, all the possible outcomes, and everything. And in that kind of decision procedure, it's often described as what you use are these cues like price and taste, and you weight them according to the probability that they'll predict the correct or the optimal choice. So you're combining a categorical judgment, like they have the same price or one of them tastes better, with a creedal judgment or a degree of belief, namely how certain am I that if they are different in this way, the one that's better on taste will be better, all things considered.
Yeah, so where did these probabilities come from? Are these probabilities going to themselves be degrees of belief that are some higher order degree of belief about which aspects of categorical judgments are going to be the most relevant in determining the overall highest expectation, or are these probabilities some sort of some other notion of probability here?
So I think that folks using these heuristics in the psych research actually don't seem to address the question. Maybe they don't have a view about whether these beliefs are expected values or beliefs about probabilities or degrees of belief, and exactly what their degrees of belief in. But it seems to me at least one interpretation could be that they are degrees of belief. But certainly they don't have to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's that's an interesting set of proposals. All right. So there's one other topic that I think we were interested in talking about a bit before we wrap things up, which was I think this issue of how does partial belief fit in with these ideas people have been talking about with basing action on knowledge.
Right.
So there have been some interesting proposals recently that, so Sarah Moss has this interesting paper where she argues that as certain beliefs...
Before we go into that, do you want to give a little bit of background on sort of the Bayesian picture of how action is generated versus how the knowledge-based picture?
Oh, sure, yeah. So, at least on the Bayesian picture, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, degrees of belief play a role in generating actions because we have degrees of belief in various states of the world. We accept that certain actions that we perform are going to have some possibility of producing one outcome, some possibility of producing some other outcome, and then we combine the values that we have for these outcomes with the degree of belief we have that each action will lead to the relevant outcome, and use the mathematics of expected utility to find out which action has the highest expected utility, and then we just perform whichever action that is. And then, of course, there's various modifications to this depending on whether, like Ramsey and perhaps Jeffrey, we think that the preferences come first before the degrees of belief, or whether we think that there's degrees of belief in utilities, and then we use some sort of heuristic to determine which one is going to be the highest expectation rather than actually doing the full calculation every time. But at any rate, in this sort of tradition, there's the idea that degrees of belief and values for outcomes together are sufficient for determining what actions one is going to do. And it doesn't look like full belief or knowledge or anything like that has to play a role in it at all. Right. But then there's this interesting new line of work, I think, often based on the interest relative tradition in talking about knowledge, which points out that often in many cases, whether or not a certain belief counts as knowledge is going to depend on how high the stakes are. And I think one of the motivations that people have given for this is that knowledge is somehow the guide to our action. If you know that something is true, that means you're going to act as though it's true. And therefore, if the stakes are very high, then what it's going to take to motivate you to act as though it's true might be higher, and so that might be a reason why whether or not you have knowledge varies with what the stakes are that depend on it.
Right. So a lot of the people in the interest relative camp, when it comes to knowledge, they actually propose that whether you should use something as a reason or as a premise in your decision on how to act depends on whether you know it. So you'd better not use anything as a premise in your practical reasoning unless you know it. And moreover, if you know something, and assuming it's relevant, then you're entitled to use it in your practical reasoning. And so I gather that's what some people have worried is incompatible with the Bayesian picture, where how you should act is determined by your degrees of belief, and on the knowledge side, people are saying how you should act is determined by what you know. And I gather, so as a start towards making those compatible, Brian Weatherson has suggested that knowledge does figure into Bayesian decision making by shaping which possibilities need to be considered. So when you distribute probabilities and utilities over a decision table, the table is determined by what you know. The possibilities that you know not to obtain, those can be excluded, and then the rest are the ones where you distribute probabilities and then plug and chug to calculate expected utility. But I gather some people might still want to go farther and say that actually that's not enough because you're still using probabilities or degrees of belief rather than knowledge to make your decision, and only knowledge should govern your decision there.
Right. Yeah, and it would seem to me that there's also some worry the other direction too, many of these states that are taking to constitute knowledge, if they constitute knowledge in one circumstance and not in another, then there must be some level on which you have a degree of belief that is high, but not 100% in that proposition. And so there's still some level on which these other possibilities are being represented, even if it's not explicit in the decision table that you're actually using. Right. So
one proposal for building on Weatherson's idea, trying to make these things compatible. So Weatherson says that the knowledge shapes the decision table, and then there's still this worry that you're still using degrees of belief or things, propositions that you have degrees of belief in that fall short of knowledge to govern your decision. One thing that you might say there is that, you're still using, insofar as you're using things as premises or as reasons, there's still things you know. So for example, one thing you know when you choose an umbrella based on a 0.4 credence, that's Schiffer's example, one thing you know is that it might rain. And so you're still acting on your knowledge. It's just that your credence acts not as a reason, but rather as a weight to that reason. So how much weight should you give the reason? So it might rain, that's the reason to carry an umbrella. How strong is the reason? That's where your credence might come into play. So it might be that credences act as weights on reasons, where the reasons are things you know. So some people might even be unhappy with that. They might even say, no doxastic state besides knowledge should affect your decisions at all. So even acting as a reason weight is still too much when it comes to
Right.
credences governing knowledge. And then I think that's where Sarah Moss's proposal comes in, the one you mentioned earlier. Do you want to go ahead and
Yes.
explain that?
Yeah. So I think the basic idea is that just as traditional epistemologists often want to say that certain of our beliefs constitute knowledge because they are, say, appropriately formed or appropriately sensitive to the evidence or whatever it takes for a belief to constitute knowledge, I believe that she wants to say that some of our degrees of belief might constitute knowledge as well because they are appropriately formed.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, my degree of belief that the coin coming up heads is 0.5, if that degree of belief is formed on the basis of, say, adequate inspection of the coin and familiarity with how coins behave in general, that might be sufficient for that degree of belief to constitute knowledge, even though there is no proposition about how the world is or will be or anything like that that is that knowledge. The knowledge just is that that my degree of belief is correct and correctly formed, or whatever it takes.
Right.
As opposed to someone else who might have degree of belief 0.5, just because they've never even considered the question, and they may not have the right reason for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the idea, it might sound kind of weird to say that a degree of belief can constitute knowledge when degrees of belief are thought of as being sort of uncertain states. But as we were talking about yesterday, actually, it's not that crazy. It's actually presupposed by the really common view that full beliefs just are high degrees of belief. So if you think a full belief just is a high degree of belief, and you thought that full beliefs can constitute knowledge, well, then you tacitly already thought that degrees of belief could constitute knowledge.
Right. Although they're different sort of knowledge, because I think in the one case where I believe that Obama is the president and that belief is constituted by my degree of belief of degree 0.9999 or whatever it is, then the object of my knowledge is the proposition that Obama is president. But I think in this coin example, what I think Sarah wants to say is that the object of the knowledge is that the probability of the coin coming up heads is 1/2, not that the coin will come up heads. And so then I think she uses some sort of machinery from expressivism to say what exactly the content of this proposition is, or I guess to explain this proposition in a way that, because it doesn't have truth conditional content, it has some content in the sense that having a belief in it or having knowledge of it just constitutes being in a certain sort of state.
Yeah, so,
is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So degrees of belief that don't constitute full beliefs, let's call them middling ones, middling degrees of belief, like degree of belief 0.4. Yeah, those it seems those it seems aren't apt to constitute knowledge like your high degree of belief that Obama's the president. For exactly that reason. It seems that they don't constitute full beliefs, and knowledge requires full belief. Moreover, they don't have truth conditions. Your degree of belief that, your 0.4 degree of belief that it'll rain might be closer to or farther from the truth, but it's not truth apt in the usual sense. So yeah, it seems like it can't constitute knowledge, and yeah, that's where Sarah brings in the expressivist machinery. One idea I wanted to try out was this idea that so if we adopt Sarah Moss's proposal that degrees of belief constitute knowledge, in particular they constitute probabilistic knowledge, knowledge that something is likely or unlikely.
Yeah.
If we take that proposal on board, and we also go with the usual view that knowledge requires belief, then it seems like whenever a credence constitutes knowledge, it also constitutes a full belief. So whenever I have credence 0.4 in something, we should be prepared to say that I believe it's 0.4 probable, or maybe I think it's reasonably probable, or something like that.
Right. Although we have to be careful, again, in noting that what it means to say that it's 0.4 probable is not that the chance is 0.4 or...
That the physical or objective chance, you mean?
Yeah, it's not a knowledge of any sort of physical probability or objective probability. This is somehow a proposition whose content involves...
Right. So that's Sarah's view, though. I actually wanted to try and offer an alternative designed to do the same sort of thing. So Sarah takes the expressivist view, right, where it's not a belief about some objective probability or anything. It has expressivist truth conditions instead, or expressivist appropriateness conditions. I wanted to try the suggestion that actually when I have a degree of belief, I do have a full belief, and it's a full belief about something. So I want to say that when I have a credence of zero point 0.4, I have a full belief that it's zero point 0.4 probable, and that the truth condition for that belief, it's true or false if my evidential probability is 0.4. So it's true or false if
Right.
the rational degree of belief for me to have would be 0.4, or if in some sense
Right.
the evidence supports the proposition to degree
Right.
0.4.
Right.
And the reason that I want to say that is because on the one hand, I think that there is an interesting connection here going. This brings us back to the metaphysics of full and partial belief. There's a metaphysical connection between partial belief and full belief, where if you have a partial belief or if you have a credence, you're only a few cognitive steps away from forming a full belief. So if I'm 0.4 sure about something and someone says, "How probable do you think that is?" It's natural for me to consult my credence and form the overt belief that it's 0.4 probable, that that's the evidential probability of the proposition in question. And then it seems like my belief, my outright or full belief there, has a truth condition. It's true or false only if my evidence really does support this proposition to 0.4.
Right.
So it seems like...
Of course, this all depends on the notion, on there being some notion of evidential probability.
Yes.
Which I guess is an idea that, I mean, certainly Williamson talks about it quite a bit in his book, Knowledge and Its Limits. And I think there are many other people that endorse this sort of notion, but there are, of course, many people that are quite skeptical of there being such a thing as an evidential probability.
Right. So I think the way I like to think about this is that we can sell the idea that credences constitute knowledge to people of either stripe. So people who think that there is such a thing as evidential or correct epistemic probability, we can sell them the idea that credences constitute knowledge because they constitute full beliefs. Full beliefs about what? Well, about evidential or epistemic probability. And credences constitute dispositional beliefs of that sort. That's the idea. And then for the people who are skeptical of this notion of epistemic or evidential probability, then we can adopt Sarah's proposal where these probabilistic beliefs aren't about propositions or about evidential probabilities. They rather have expressivist truth or appropriateness conditions.
Right.
But it seems like everybody, whichever way we interpret the truth of a probabilistic belief, when we say that someone believes it's 0.4 probable, whether we go with evidential probability truth conditions or expressivist truth conditions, we still are going to want to say at the end of the day, whatever our theoretical commitments, that such beliefs are true or false, because that seems to be a regular part of our discourse.
Is that right? That we have that as a regular part of our discourse?
Good question. I think so. What do you think?
Yeah. So I'm not very convinced about that. I think that there are some cases where I think I do accept that, like when someone says there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow, and I might say that's true or that's not true. I think I might be talking about some actual chances here, but it's not clear to me that whether or not I'm inclined to say that that some of these other that are cases that are clearly epistemic. I'm not so sure whether or not I want to say that these claims are either true or false.
Okay.
But
so,
I'm just sort of hesitant at the moment to go one way or the other about this.
Right.
I'm not, and it looks like on these two approaches we're talking about, there's something controversial each way. Either we have to accept the controversial claim that there are evidential probabilities, or accept the controversial claim that there's some expressivist notion of the propositions that's going on here.
Right. So I think you're right that either way is controversial. But I think I'm still optimistic because I think that whichever way you go is controversial, but that you have to go one way or the other, or something in this vein, I think isn't all that controversial. And so I think we can sort of offer a dilemma, like say you can go one way or the other. We don't care which way you go, insofar as we're just trying to show that credences can constitute probabilistic knowledge, that when someone has 0.4 credence, they can know that such and such is 0.4 probable. So you might have to take a controversial position whichever way you go, but whichever controversial way you go, we still get that credences constitute knowledge, and thus there's no tension between the knowledge-based picture of rational decision and the Bayesian picture. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
So I think to the people that are happy with this claim that that our ordinary talk of probabilities in these cases really is truth apt one way or the other, that's going to work. Um, I would need to think about this a bit more before going along with it, but I'm also not as committed to the idea that whatever's playing a role in our decision making has to be knowledge.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Well, I think I've said everything that I know about partial and
Yeah,
full belief, so I might be tapped out. How about you?
yeah. I think that's what we're here with. All right.
All right. So let's.
All right.
Thanks a lot, and I'll sign off.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Talk to
Good
you
talking
later.
to you.